Welcome. We're diving into a really fascinating and kind of complex question from Hindu family law. Basically, when one person takes out a loan, can the entire family's property be put on the line to pay it back? We're going to break this all down in two parts, and we're starting right now. Okay, so here's our roadmap for this first part. First, we're going to look at who actually has the power to take out a loan for the family. Then we'll flip it and look at the responsibilities of the person giving the loan. And finally, we'll get to the big one. When does that debt actually bind the whole family?
So let's kick things off with the most fundamental question of all: who can actually sign the paperwork for a family loan?
Let's just put it in simple, practical terms. The family needs cash, maybe for a business, maybe for a wedding. Who has the actual legal authority to go to a bank, sign on that dotted line, and legally bind the entire family to that debt? Well, the answer is the Kardata. Now, in a Hindu undivided family, or HUF, the Kardata is basically the manager. They're the one who handles the property, the business, all the family's affairs, and crucially, this job includes the power to take on debt on behalf of everyone. Now, this power isn't just some old tradition. It's actually grounded in a huge legal precedent. The authority of the Karta was really cemented in this landmark case, Hanuman Prasad, which pretty much set the stage for how all these debts are viewed in the eyes of the law. But, and this is a big but, this power isn't a blank check. A Karta can't just take out a loan to buy a sports car. The debt has to be for what's called a legal necessity, which means it has to be for a purpose that actually benefits or protects the family's estate. Things like paying taxes, supporting family members, paying for a wedding, or even covering other legitimate family debts. Okay, so let's flip the coin for a second. What about the person or the bank that's giving the loan? What are their responsibilities, and what kind of legal protections do they have? This quote really gets to the heart of it. A lender can't just hand over a pile of cash without asking any questions. To be considered a bona fide lender, that is, a lender acting in good faith, they have to do their homework. They need to ask the Karta why they need the loan and feel satisfied that it's for a real family purpose. And this is a super important protection for that lender. As long as they made that good faith inquiry, the law has their back. Even if it turns out later that the Karta wasn't being totally honest about the reason for the loan, it's still considered valid, because the lender did their part. All right, so this brings us to the bottom line, the question that really matters. When a loan is all good and valid, whose property is actually on the hook to pay it back? This is where it gets very real for every single person in the family. It really comes down to two different outcomes. If the debt is considered binding, meaning it was for a legit legal necessity and the lender did their due diligence, then the entire joint family property can be used to pay it back. But if it's non-binding, the risk is contained. The lender can only go after the Karta's personal money and property. So let's walk through just how serious a binding debt can be. The Karta takes the loan. If it's not paid back, the lender can come after the whole family's property. A court could even order that property to be sold off at an auction. And here's the kicker. The person who buys that property gets the ownership interest of every single family member. The stakes are unbelievably high. Okay, so those are the general rules that apply to any Karta. But things get way more complicated when the Karta also happens to be a father. This special relationship brings a really ancient and powerful legal idea into play, which, you guessed it, brings us right to the second part of our explainer. Welcome back. Now we're going to dive into a really unique legal principle that applies specifically when a father takes out a loan. It's called the Doctrine of Pious Obligation. So here's our game plan. First, we'll get to the bottom of what this pious duty of a son actually is. Then, we'll look at the one big exception to the rule. And finally, we'll see how this really old doctrine has changed and adapted over time in modern law. To really get this, we have to take a step back and look at the spiritual and moral foundations of Hindu law, because this whole idea is about way more than just paying off a loan. And this quote, wow, it just gets right to the heart of it. The traditional belief is that a man who dies with unpaid debts suffers in the afterlife. So the pious obligation is the son's moral and even religious duty to pay his father's debts, not just to clear a financial slate, but literally to save his father's soul. So this doctrine completely flips the script on the rules we just talked about. Remember how important legal necessity was? Well, under the pious obligation, that rule gets thrown right out the window. A son is required to use his share of the family property to pay off his father's personal debts, even if that loan didn't benefit the family in any way, shape, or form. But hold on, this obligation isn't totally absolute. The law draws a very clear line in the sand. There's a major exception for certain kinds of debts. And the key legal term for this concept comes from Sanskrit. It's known as avyaharika. So these avyaharika debts are basically loans taken for illegal or immoral reasons. Think gambling debts or money to pay off fines from a crime. The son's spiritual duty doesn't extend to paying for his father's bad deeds. The obligation is only for the father's non-immoral personal debts. So you've got this ancient spiritual concept. How has it been handled and adapted by modern courts? Let's take a look at how this doctrine has actually evolved over the years. This table really shows the key changes. Originally, this duty only kicked in after the father passed away. Now, it applies even while he's still alive. The scope of who is liable has also expanded to include sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons pretty much equally. And here's a huge one. Modern law limits the obligation only to the son's share of the joint family property, protecting any property he might have earned or acquired on his own. Nothing makes this clearer than a real-world case. In Fakir Chand v. Harnam Kaur, a father mortgaged some property. His sons later tried to argue that, hey, there was no legal necessity for that loan, so their shares of the property should be safe. But the Supreme Court said, nope. Since the debt wasn't for an immoral purpose, the doctrine of pious obligation trumped the whole necessity argument, and the sons were held liable. And all of this brings us to one final big question to think about. How does a legal principle that was born from a spiritual duty to save a father's soul fit into our modern world of finance, individual rights, and personal responsibility? It's a really incredible intersection of ancient belief and modern law. Thanks so much for joining me.